Welcome to one of the most harrowing sights ever witnessed on the Western Front. July 1916. The Battle of the Somme had begun, and in the mud-choked trenches of northern France something happened that made even seasoned officers stare in disbelief. They'd marched across Europe, survived months of shellfire, watched comrades vanish beneath artillery, and now here they were, the Royal Irish Rifles, soaked to the bone, rifles in hand, standing amid the shattered earth and twisted barbed wire. A soldier paused, the mud swallowing his boots, staring at the horizon where shells fell like thunderbolts, and for a brief, impossible moment, silence settled. No commands, no explosions, just the strange, heavy stillness of a battlefield that had already devoured too many. Somewhere beyond the trenches, the faint groan of wounded men mingled with the distant roar of artillery. A young private, maybe 19, handed a water bottle to a comrade hesitant, eyes darting to the cratered ground as if unsure whether this act of care was courage or folly. They called him Sean, a name among many, yet in that instant he was just a man reaching out in the midst of death, trying to hold on to something human. Witnesses later said he whispered, "Hold on," and for a brief second, the endless barrage seemed to pause. The officers leaned against sandbags, unsure whether to order forward or simply breathe. The stretcher-bearers moved silently, carrying men too broken to stand. A lone bugle played a tune lost to the chaos, barely audible above the thunder. The soldiers couldn't believe it. After weeks of horror and relentless fire, a moment of human connection appeared amid the carnage, a paradox that no training could prepare them for. But beyond the mud lay something deeper. Because not far from the front lines, civilians watched from a distance, huddled in fear, barred from even glimpsing the fleeting mercy on the battlefield. It was a paradox too vast for the scarred landscape to contain. A land of devastation, yet moments of fleeting humanity. A place where courage crossed trenches faster than artillery ever could. That's where our story begins. In a quiet corner of hell on earth, where soldiers endured horrors few could imagine, and yet still found brief, impossible flashes of life. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, could you have offered a hand to a stranger amid death all around you? And if you had, what would that say about your courage and your humanity? July 1916, northern France. The Somme stretched endlessly, a scarred ribbon of earth crisscrossed with trenches, shell craters, and shattered trees. Dawn arrived pale and gray, a thin veil over the battlefield. Fog rolled in from the river, curling through the mud, obscuring the shapes of men and machines alike. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, churned soil, and sweat. Boots sank into the wet earth, rifles caked with mud. Voices were low, yet carried across the trenches, bouncing against sandbags and the steel of artillery emplacements. The Royal Irish Rifles moved quietly, each squad aware that a single misstep could mean death. The enemy lines loomed just beyond no man's land, distant yet close enough to see the flashes of their guns and the brief, ominous rise of smoke. The soundscape was a cacophony of the living and the dying artillery, booming shells, whistling overhead, the crackle of machine guns, men shouting orders, men screaming, men praying under their breath. The regiment had marched for weeks prior, leaving behind villages, railways, and the last semblance of normal life. Letters from home were rare. Mail often delayed or lost, and yet the men carried photographs, dog-eared and fading, tucked into breast pockets, a reminder of what they were fighting for, or perhaps what they would never see again. Mornings began before sunrise, the cold dew soaking through uniforms. Breakfast often non-existent, rations meager and quickly consumed, washed down with the thick, bitter coffee that did little to chase the chill from their bones. Mud and blood became inseparable, mixed together beneath their boots. The trenches themselves were narrow, carved into the earth lined with timber sandbags, and the detritus of war, spent shells, broken rifles, discarded helmets. Rats thrived in this world, growing bold, unafraid of the men who occasionally kicked them away. Disease lingered in stagnant water in close quarters in the constant exhaustion. And yet, amidst the chaos, the soldiers moved with purpose. Drills and orders etched into muscle memory. A rhythm of survival, a cadence of death. Corporal O'Leary checked his men eyes, scanning the muddy parapets, counting heads, noting the wounded. He whispered encouragement, a word, a gesture, small acts of humanity, in a landscape defined by devastation. Shells rained across the horizon, and yet life persisted, a defiance written in the stubborn endurance of men and machinery alike. Artillery crews cranked shells into guns, sweat mixing with grime. Observers scanned with binoculars, noting every flash across the German lines. The enemy was close enough to see their movements, far enough that the immediate danger could never be fully measured. No man knew what awaited beyond the next trench. A mine could detonate at any step, a sniper's bullet could strike silently. Yet the Irish rifles advanced in disciplined waves. Small squads slipping through communication trenches, carrying stretchers, ammunition, and hope in equal measure. The officers called orders sharply, cutting through the fog, through the noise. Forward hold, cover commands that echoed across the landscape, bouncing off barbed wire and crater walls, mingling with groans, whispers, and the occasional laugh that was too brittle to last. The ground itself seemed to rebel against them. Mud clung to boots and hands, sucking men down, slowing movements. Rain had turned the craters into pools of brown water, reflecting flashes from distant explosions. Barbed wire snaked across the terrain, sharp and unyielding, a tangle of death and defiance. The sky hung low and gray, promising rain yet holding back. Smoke from distant shells drifted across the field, settling into the mud, coating rifles, faces, and hearts, with a sense of inescapable dread. Yet life, fleeting, fragile, and stubborn, persisted. A pigeon flew across the lines, carrying messages that could alter lives. A wounded man clutched a letter crumpled in his fist, breathing shallow, hoping to survive long enough to read it. A nurse or stretcher-bearer appeared in the distance, silhouetted against smoke, moving with purpose. Small gestures, almost invisible yet monumental, in a world consumed by mechanized death. The men of the Royal Irish Rifles knew each other's faces, memorized every scar and freckle. They shared stories whispered in the dark about home, about sisters, mothers' dreams. They laughed at jokes that would seem cruel in other circumstances, a defiance against despair. Sometimes a whistle sounded, signaling a bombardment. Men pressed flat to the mud hearts, pounding, every instinct screaming. And yet, when the order came, they rose, rifles ready, boots sloshing through mire, moving toward a horizon that promised nothing but survival or death. In the midst of all this, silence had a voice. A pause in the chaos could bring clarity or the momentary illusion of peace. Men would glance across the trench, seeing comrades staring at the same horizon, sharing a look that spoke more than words. The weight of history pressed down on them. The Battle of the Somme was not just a clash of armies. It was a test of endurance, of courage, of humanity itself. And as dawn slowly gave way to the harsh light of day, the Royal Irish Rifles pressed on, navigating shattered earth, navigating the fog of war, aware that every step, every breath, every heartbeat could be their last, yet moving forward. Because in that mud, in that smoke, in that hellish expanse, they found a rhythm of survival, a thread of defiance, a glimmer of something that made life worth enduring even here, even now. The records from July 1916 are unforgiving. Official war diaries from the Royal Irish Rifles paint a stark picture. 32 officers, over 600 men entering the front lines, with hearts full of discipline and minds sharpened by drills, yet unprepared for the mud, the blood, the sheer chaos awaiting them. Artillery from both sides rained down relentlessly. The British War Office reported over 57,000 casualties on the first day. Alone a figure that seemed almost abstract when confronted with the screams and groans echoing from every trench. Shell fragments tore through timber and earth, cutting through flesh and bone with indiscriminate precision. Rifles jammed from mud and sweat, bayonets dulled boots heavy and waterlogged. The German defenses were formidable. Concrete bunkers interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests lining no man's land. Observers noted over 400 heavy artillery pieces positioned along the front. They had calculated that their firepower could halt any infantry assault, yet the Irish rifles advanced step by step, despite the overwhelming odds. The battle plans detailed in the trenches' handwritten maps showed the complexity of coordination units, synchronized by whistle signal flags, and runners carrying orders across open fields. A single miscommunication could mean death. Yet the men moved with a precision that belied the terror surrounding them. Letters from soldiers surviving the first hours tell another story. Private McKenna wrote, "We crawled through the mud, every step a prayer. The ground exploded around us. Friends vanished in the dust. Yet we pressed on because what else could we do?" His words were smudged ink mixed with blood, a testament to the struggle to survive. Another diary belonging to Sergeant O'Donnell noted, "The air smelled of iron and smoke. I could hear the cries of men I'd known for weeks now, silent. The earth itself seemed to shake with their absence. I wondered if God had forgotten us." These first-hand accounts ground the battle in human reality. Numbers become flesh, statistics become lives. And yet, in the midst of this grinding reality, folklore arose among the men. Whispers of the phantom battalion circulated in the trenches. A shadowy company of soldiers said to appear where the fighting was fiercest, moving silently unseen by the enemy, yet somehow turning the tide for their comrades. It was impossible to verify, yet stories persisted. Private Kelly swore he saw figures advancing in the mist, rifles gleaming, faces obscured. When he blinked, they were gone, leaving only a glimmer of hope and the unsettling sense that the battlefield itself had become alive. The old Irish songs hummed in the dark, carried softly by men too tired to sing, but needing to remember home. The melodies intertwined with the gunfire, creating a rhythm that steadied hands and hearts. Back in the reports, ammunition usage was staggering. Over 100,000 rounds fired by the Royal Irish Rifles in a single day, not counting artillery support. Communication failures were catalogued meticulously. Dozens of runners never reached their posts. Telegraph lines shredded by bombardment. Yet somehow the attack maintained cohesion. Coordination became a ballet of desperation and training, each movement calculated against probability of death. The numbers are almost impossible to reconcile with the lived experience. How could men maintain focus under constant shelling, under an unrelenting rain of metal and mud? And the earth itself seemed to conspire against them. Trenches flooded with rain, mixing with blood and decomposing matter. Rats bold enough to bite fingers while men slept yet ignored in exhaustion. Disease spreading quietly, dysentery, trench foot influenza, claiming bodies silently. One report noted over 300 cases of trench foot in a single company within days. The physical toll was immense, yet morale remained fragilely intact. Letters describe prayers whispered over the dead, small acts of kindness shared amidst horror. A chocolate bar offered a hand held briefly, a letter read aloud to a fallen comrade. These acts became myth whispered along the lines. The folklore layer continued to grow. Stories of the trench ghosts circulated, comrades lost in craters, returning in dreams to warn of incoming fire. Sergeant O'Connell later wrote, I saw him again, the lad from Derry. He pointed to the wire, then vanished. I woke, my heart racing. I swear he saved my life. Such tales provided both comfort and terror, a psychological counterpoint to the cold statistics. The battlefield itself became a character unpredictable, alive, almost sentient. Maps from the War Office corroborate some of these accounts. The trenches stretched for miles, connected by communication ditches, overrun sections, temporary fortifications. Enemy fortifications catalogued, shell impact zones recorded. Juxtaposed with the diaries and folklore, a layered picture emerges, one of methodical planning, colliding with the chaotic, almost supernatural experiences of men enduring the impossible. Every crater, every bunker, every stretch of mud held stories, some verified, some whispered, all contributing to the tapestry of the Somme. By midday, the regiment had advanced less than a mile, yet the casualties were heavy. The first wave lost nearly 40% of its men, yet survivors moved through the carnage, dragging the wounded, shouting warnings, whispering prayers. The juxtaposition of life and death became surreal. A single rifle shot could end a life. A single glance could reveal a miracle of survival. Fact and folklore intertwined, both necessary to convey the truth of the battle. The first day's end left the Royal Irish Rifles diminished but unbroken. Reports catalogued the men's resilience, the calculated risks, the staggering cost. Stories of heroism emerged, a corporal carrying 3 wounded men through a shell-scarred field, privates maintaining firing positions under impossible odds. And the myths persisted, tales of unseen guardians of voices, guiding men through mud and chaos, of courage manifesting almost beyond human capacity. The Somme was not only a test of strategy, of artillery, of numbers. It was a crucible of the human spirit. Fact layer laid bare the staggering losses, the numbers, the logistics, the machinery. Folklore layer revealed how men endured, how myths arose, how hope flickered in the darkest hours. Together they form the lens through which we begin to understand not just a battle, but the reality of what it meant to survive. And as the smoke lifted over the trenches that evening, as the wind carried whispers of both fear and legend, the men prepared for the next day, knowing the Somme would demand more than courage, it would demand everything. Yet in every crumpled letter, every whispered song, every shadow moving through the fog, there remained a thread of life. A reminder that even amid the horrors few could imagine, humanity endured. The mud clung to every boot, every uniform, every soul. Private Thomas Murphy crouched low in the trench water, seeping through the seams of his coat, freezing his fingers to the rifle he held like a lifeline. He had not slept for 2 nights yet. His eyes scanned the no-man's land ahead, following shapes that might be friend or foe. The roar of artillery echoed in his chest, a percussion that refused to cease. He could hear the whistle of shells, the distant cries of men caught in the open, and somewhere faint but persistent, the low groan of comrades trapped beneath the shattered earth. Corporal James O'Reilly leaned against a sandbag, mud smeared across his face, wiping sweat and blood with the back of his sleeve. He checked the strap on his bayonet, counting the rounds in his rifle, listening for any sound that would betray movement in the enemy lines. A runner passed, panting, delivering a note from headquarters. Orders to advance at dawn. The words seemed almost absurd, almost cruel. How could anyone think of marching across that expanse of death? Yet he nodded, folded the note into his pocket, and gave a silent prayer that it would be enough. Somewhere down the trench, Private Sean Kelly hummed an old Irish tune, a ghost of a melody from home. The notes were swallowed almost immediately by the cacophony around him, yet it steadied his breathing, gave rhythm to his fingers gripping the rifle. He glanced at the young lad beside him, barely 16, eyes wide, pale teeth chattering. Murphy caught his gaze and offered a reassuring nod. a fleeting human connection amid the unrelenting chaos. A shell exploded nearby, throwing earth and water into the air. Murphy ducked instinctively. The young lad screamed a high-pitched sound that made O'Reilly wince. Yet within moments, the boy was moving, following the rhythm of survival. Each man learning to act not for glory, not for orders, but because movement meant life. Hesitation meant death. Instinct became ritual. And then, in a brief lull, voices rose. Muted, urgent. A wounded soldier called for help, trapped in a side trench. Murphy and O'Reilly exchanged a glance. Without words, they dropped into the mud, sliding toward him. The ground sucked at their boots. The smell of cordite blood and something sweeter fear mingled with determination. They reached him, a private from another company, his leg pinned beneath timber and earth. Murphy whispered, "Hold on, lad. We've got you." And with combined effort, they freed him. The moment lasted seconds, but in it humanity prevailed. Nearby, Sergeant O'Connell surveyed the trench, noting men assisting the wounded others preparing to move forward. His eyes caught the flicker of movement in the mist. A shadow, perhaps. A comrade, perhaps. A trick of the fog. Folklore whispered among men in these trenches spoke of phantoms of the Somme figures, appearing to guide soldiers through impossible terrain, warning them of incoming fire, urging them forward when instinct screamed to stay. He smiled grimly, acknowledging the legend, yet knowing that hope, real or imagined, could save lives. The scene shifted as dawn broke higher. Light revealed the destruction in vivid clarity. Shell craters filled with water, barbed wire tangled across the ground, like the ribs of some monstrous beast, mangled rifles, broken helmets. And in the midst of it all, men moved with purpose, some carrying stretchers, others firing to cover the advance. The young lad gripped Murphy's arm, trembling. Murphy whispered, "Step by step. Don't look down, just step. We'll get through this." And the boy did, following rhythm, following instinct, following courage. O'Reilly paused, hearing the faint whistle of an incoming barrage. He pressed his body against the trench wall. Shells screamed overhead. Dirt and debris rained down. He counted each breath, each heartbeat, each second. The human scale of this battle became evident. Statistics on paper could never capture the terror, the courage, the desperation. Yet in this microcosm, in these trenches, each soldier lived and died as a testament to both. And yet, life persisted. A pigeon fluttered past, carrying messages that might alter the fates of units. A letter clutched in trembling hands. Murphy read aloud, a fragment voice shaking, sharing a piece of home, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The momentary warmth of memory stood in stark contrast to the mud, the blood, the screaming, and the cold. Stories circulated even in this chaos. Whispers of comrades appearing where death should have claimed them. Of figures moving unseen across no man's land, guiding or warning. The men spoke of them quietly, half in fear, half in reverence. Folklore layered onto fact. Each act of bravery, each rescue, each fleeting moment of mercy became myth. Survival was measured not only in living through the day, but in preserving one's humanity. By midday, the regiment had endured waves of shellfire. Men were wounded, missing, or dead. Yet the advance continued. The human scene was defined not by strategy or orders alone, but by courage, instinct, and fleeting compassion. Every glance, every hand extended to a comrade, every whispered word mattered. Fact layer tallied the losses, the logistics, the firepower. Human scene revealed the lives behind those numbers. The voices, the trembling hands, the hope clinging to mud and steel. As the sun dipped, lower shadows stretched across the trenches. Murphy O'Reilly. Kelly and the young lad paused. Momentarily silence fell. A pause in the ceaseless roar. They looked across the scarred earth, saw comrades helping, Comrades witnessed courage amid chaos and understood the human dimension of war was a fragile, extraordinary thing. In that brief, breathless moment, life, death, and myth intertwined, and the Royal Irish Rifles endured step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, through horrors few could imagine. The Somme was a battlefield measured not just in mud and blood, but in numbers chilling, immutable, impossible to ignore. The Royal Irish Rifles faced a calculated enemy entrenched and prepared. German defenses stretched across miles of earth, a lattice of steel and timber machine guns, nested every 100 yards, artillery registered precisely by maps and observation posts. Intelligence reports recorded 400 heavy pieces along the front, each capable of raining destruction on advancing men. Trenches deep and interlocking wire entanglements, sharp as razors, every foot of ground, accounted for a machine of death meticulously designed to halt any assault. Yet the rifles advanced, slowly, painfully, through this engineered hell. The War Office documented over 57,000 casualties on the first day alone, the largest in British military history. The numbers were staggering, yet they failed to convey the reality, the terror, the courage compressed into every heartbeat, a platoon reduced to a handful of men, yet still pushing forward, still dragging comrades from mud-filled craters, still moving as one under the relentless bombardment. The contrast was striking. Outgunned, outmanned, yet undeterred, the German artillery fired 10,000 shells in the opening hours. The British response matching only a fraction, yet each Irish soldier moved through that storm guided by training instinct and perhaps something harder to quantify. Whispers among men spoke of unseen forces, phantom figures emerging in the mist, to direct them around danger, alert them to falling shells, or simply remind them that they were not alone. Folklore and fact entwined seamlessly. The Phantom Battalion persisted in rumor, yet it shaped behavior, encouraged risk-taking, preserved life. Logistics failed them at times. Communication lines cut, runners shot down or lost in craters. Ammunition delayed, water, scarce food rationed to the bare minimum. Yet discipline held. Fact, Layer counted what could be quantified, the distance advanced rounds, fired casualties, taken craters, navigated. The regiment moved in waves of precision born of necessity. Folklore. Layer recorded what could not be measured, courage, fear, whispered legends, quiet heroism amid chaos. Both layers intertwined to give a sense of the battlefield that neither alone could convey. Artillery shells exploded at intervals, punctuating the air with smoke and heat. Every man became a node in a network of survival firing, moving, retreating, dragging, carrying. The War Office notes describe dozens of officers killed within minutes of the opening barrage, yet the men adapted. Leadership emerged spontaneously. Corporals, sergeants, privates, stepping into roles dictated not by rank alone, but by necessity. The human element remained decisive despite overwhelming mechanized force. Numbers tell part of the story. Officers 600 men at the start. By nightfall, only 360 remained uninjured, yet the advance continued. 100,000 rifle rounds expended by the regiment, dozens of heavy shells dropped per minute into no man's land. Yet the trenches held the lines pressed forward, the rhythm of battle continuing. Each number a life, each life a story, each story layered with myth and memory. The Germans expected the attack to collapse within hours. Fortified positions, overlapping fire, calculated defenses, they believed victory certain. Yet reality diverged sharply. Irish rifles pressed on. Minor successes became totems of hope. A section clearing a trench, another rescuing the wounded under fire. The contrast between expectation and execution created a surreal tension. Outgunned yet enduring, outnumbered yet cohesive, the battlefield revealed the limits of prediction. Folklore accentuated this contrast. Whispered tales of soldiers appearing where none should be, men crediting unseen guides for survival, stories of comrade souls emerging from mist to warn of artillery of voices carried on the wind, repeating orders, repeating names, repeating caution. In the diaries, some dismissed them as exhaustion or hallucination. Others swore they saved lives. The legends became embedded in the identity of the regiment, shaping decisions, morale, and perception. The terrain itself exacerbated the disparity. Craters up to 20 feet deep, mud sucking at boots wire, snagging rifles and clothing. Visibility low, fog and smoke combining to conceal death and opportunity alike. Men adapted, measuring distances by ear and intuition, moving according to rhythm rather than sight. Each step balanced probability, courage, and a whisper of legend. As afternoon wore on, the toll mounted. Stretcher bearers navigating across broken ground, carrying the wounded under intermittent fire. O'Reilly noted in his journal, "Every man I lifted became a story, a life, a heartbeat tethered to ours. And still we moved forward step by step. Fact and folklore collided, numbers of wounded catalogued meticulously. Yet the miraculous survival, the small acts of courage, the whispered guidance of unseen hands, unquantifiable, yet just as real. The day's end brought clarity and horror. Reports tallied lines, drawn losses, recorded the regiment's advance, measured in feet and inches, in lives spent in territory gained. Yet within those figures were threads of myth, bravery, human connection. The juxtaposition created an understanding that war was not only about numbers and maps. It was about the human capacity to endure, to act, to survive amid impossible odds. By twilight, the soldiers rested briefly, eyes scanning the horizon, ears listening to the night's soft murmurs. The phantom battalion stories circulated again quietly. Whispers of spectral figures appearing amid smoke, guiding or warning. Men lit small fires in craters, shared scant rations, exchanged nods of understanding. The human dimension persisted, weaving fact and folklore into a tapestry that defined not only the Royal Irish Rifles but the very experience of the Somme. And as darkness fell, the regiment held positions with weary vigilance. Artillery, distant rifles, low men breathing shallow minds, still alive to legend and memory. Fact layer quantified loss and advance. Folklore layer preserved courage, hope, and myth. Together they gave meaning to the chaos and prepared them for the next day where horror and heroism would again collide. By the end of the first day at the Somme, the Royal Irish Rifles had moved mere hundreds of yards. Yet the toll was staggering. Over 300 men wounded, dozens dead, entire sections reduced to shadows of themselves. Reports catalogued every casualty, every spent shell, every crater navigated. The War Office noted that the regiment had advanced, despite the odds, disciplined, determined, and defiant. The numbers alone were staggering. 57,000 British casualties in a single day, the largest in the history of the Empire. Statistics on paper, cold and abstract. Yet each number represented a heartbeat, a life interrupted, a story abruptly silenced. And yet, amidst the carnage, stories of survival emerged. Whispers in the trenches told of soldiers saved by sheer instinct, of comrades pulled from mud-filled craters at the last moment, of whispered warnings from figures half seen in mist and smoke. The legends of the Phantom Battalion persisted. Men credited their survival to something beyond training, a presence guiding them through chaos, warning them where death waited. Folklore and reality interlaced seamlessly. One could not exist without the other. Lieutenant Patrick Sullivan recorded in his journal, "I saw men I thought were gone, crawling out of craters where I had seen no sign of life. Whether it was courage or something else, I cannot say. But it saved them, and perhaps it saved us all. These accounts, repeated quietly in hushed voices, became a lifeline. A thread of hope spun through horror, the human psyche clinging to meaning in a world defined by chaos. The battlefield itself bore the marks of this struggle. Shell craters filled with water bodies and debris, barbed wire twisted into grotesque shapes, uniforms, shredded faces, streaked with mud, blood, and sweat. Yet amid this devastation, acts of humanity persisted. A corporal carried 2 wounded men on a stretcher, moving with care through the shattered earth. A private shared his ration of bread and water with a comrade whose supplies had been destroyed. Small gestures in a landscape designed to annihilate. By evening, the survivors held their positions, exhausted but unbroken. The sky a bruised purple over the scarred terrain. Artillery distant but still rumbling. The air thick with smoke cordite and the lingering scent of fear. Yet in moments of quiet, men whispered prayers, hummed songs from home, or recounted tales of comrades who had appeared where they should have perished. Folklore became a balm, a thread of humanity in the relentless machinery of war. The aftermath extended beyond the first day. Letters carried back to families described the relentless advance, the horror of mud and wire, the bravery of men who faced death at every step. Diaries recounted the extraordinary endurance of the Irish Rifles. Official reports acknowledged the staggering cost in men and material, yet commended the regiment's tenacity. Fact layer and folklore. Layer intertwined the cold ledger of statistics, met the whispered legends that buoyed morale and preserved humanity. In the days following, the regiment consolidated positions. Trenches reinforced casualties, tended where possible. Stretcher bearers moved tirelessly, carrying the wounded through mud and shell fire. Survivors told of shadows moving in the mist, of silent figures, guiding them through the deadliest sectors. The stories grew into myths, some laughed. Some believed, all respected the power of hope amidst terror. The psychological impact was profound. Men wrote of nightmares of comrades appearing in dreams, guiding or warning. Folklore became a coping mechanism, a way to navigate the incomprehensible scale of destruction. The battlefield itself seemed to breathe, responding to courage, fear, and persistence. Each step forward was a negotiation with death, a negotiation with fate. By the end of the week, the regiment had achieved modest territorial gains. Yet the human cost was immense. The war diary noted dozens of officers killed or incapacitated, hundreds of men wounded. Yet the regiment endured, motivated by duty camaraderie and the fragile hope spun from myth and memory. Every act of survival reinforced the next, a cycle of courage perpetuated in mud, blood, and whispered stories. And then came reflection. Letters sent home, journals penned in the quiet of night, conversations shared under candlelight in dugouts. Men tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. How comrades could vanish and reappear in legend. How moments of humanity persisted amidst systematic slaughter. Fact layer quantified lost logistics and progress. Folklore. Layer preserved meaning, hope, and continuity. Together they formed a portrait not only of battle, but of endurance of the human spirit in extremis. By twilight, on the 7th day, the regiment paused briefly, surveying the devastated landscape. Each crater, each trench, each stretch of mud held the imprint of life and death. Men whispered the names of the fallen, recalled acts of bravery, shared quiet moments of gratitude. The legend of the Phantom Battalion was retold, a testament to the interplay of courage, chance, and perhaps something unexplainable that guided men through horrors few could imagine. And as darkness descended over the Somme, a strange silence fell, punctuated only by distant artillery. The soldiers huddled in trenches, mud clinging to uniforms, faces streaked with dirt, sweat, and blood. They reflected on what had been endured, what had been lost, on the fragile thread of hope that had carried them. and on the legends that had sustained them. The Somme was not just a battle of artillery and infantry, it was a crucible of endurance, a canvas for courage, a space where myth and fact intertwined, where every step forward, every act of humanity, every whispered warning created a legacy that would outlast the trenches themselves. And somewhere in the dark, amidst mud and silence, the echoes of that first week lingered, guiding warning, inspiring, a reminder that even in the face of horrors few could imagine, the human spirit endured, and in that endurance lay the story of the Royal Irish Rifles. Some lessons were carved into mud and steel, some whispered through the fog. The Somme did not end with a single day, a single regiment, or a single order. It lingered. In the trenches, in the letters, in the whispered stories of men who had survived. The Royal Irish Rifles walked forward through chaos, through death, through a landscape that seemed to breathe despair. Yet their endurance left traces that could not be measured by maps or casualty lists. The earth still remembers. The craters, the wire, the shell-scarred soil. They hold echoes of every heartbeat, every shout, every whispered warning. The Phantom Battalion. The shadows that guided men through the mist were not just legend. They were the embodiment of courage, instinct, and hope. They moved where numbers failed, where orders could not reach. They became part of the landscape, part of the rhythm of survival. In letters sent home, in diaries pressed close to hearts, men wrote of fleeting moments of humanity, of a comrade sharing water, a whispered prayer over the wounded, a hand held for courage. These small gestures resonated more than any official report. They became folklore. The stories of the trenches passed from one man to another, from one generation to the next, growing in weight and meaning. The Somme's toll was staggering. Tens of thousands lost, hundreds of thousands scarred. Yet in every act of endurance, in every heartbeat that refused to surrender, there was life. And the memory of that life carried on, a legacy of resilience in mud, in blood, in legend. Fact and folklore intertwined. Cold numbers met whispered tales. The ledger of loss met the warmth of human connection. Each element vital to understanding the reality of that battlefield. Even decades later, historians and descendants trace the footprints of those men. They read journals, study maps, visit cemeteries. They hear the faint echoes of voices in the wind over the fields. And sometimes, just sometimes, they swear they feel guidance from the shadows of those who walked before. The stories endure. The lessons endure. The courage endures. And yet the Somme is a paradox, a place where humanity and horror coexist, where a rifle, a song, a whispered warning, and a shared glance can define survival, where the dead are remembered not only in numbers, but in the acts of those who lived, in the stories passed quietly, in the myths that shaped courage. The battlefield becomes more than land. It becomes memory. It becomes mirror, reflecting both what was lost and what survived. As twilight falls over the fields, once filled with gunfire, one can almost see the silhouettes of men moving through mist. Some carrying rifles, others stretchers, all guided by courage, instinct, and the whispers of the past. The Somme does not speak in commands or reports. It speaks in silence, in the rhythm of mud squelching under boots, in the distant roll of artillery remembered in echoes, in the quiet determination that carried men forward. We are left with questions. What if they hadn't endured? What if courage had failed to meet chaos? Would the Somme have claimed even more than it did? Or would legend have emerged elsewhere, to guide men through impossible odds? These questions linger, like smoke over craters, like footsteps across frozen mud, unanswered yet potent, demanding reflection. Some lessons were written in smoke and steel, others in silence. The echoes of the Royal Irish Rifles carry beyond history books, beyond diaries, into imagination, memory, and the collective consciousness. Their footsteps are still heard in the rhythm of courage. Their whispers still move through the mist, and the landscape holds them, always. Next, we will see how the echoes of battles like the Somme shaped the armies that followed. How myths born in mud and blood informed strategy, morale, and the very understanding of war. Yet for now, pause, breathe, and let the silence of that first week in July 1916 settle around you. Let it remind you that even amidst horrors few could imagine, humanity endures. The flag may have moved forward. The earth may have shifted. Shells may have buried the past. Yet the story persists, in song, in story, in whispered prayer. In every soldier who steps into the mud with courage, into the unknown with heart intact. The Royal Irish Rifles endure in memory, in legend, in the heartbeat of history. And as the wind passes over the scarred fields, carry their footsteps in your mind. Let the echoes guide you not to battle but to understanding, not to despair but to reflection. The Somme remains, and so do they.